afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to present my ideas on how clustering can be helpful when considering defences. What's the aim of this process? Well, it is to determine where and how your defence concedes its shots. And so, from a performance analysis point of view, it's where you look to improve. From an opposition analysis point of view, it's where you look to attack. I'd first like to outline the process that is taken before we go on to the applications. So, we start with all sequences that end with a shot against our defence. Now, of these sequences, about 85% are from open play situations. For simplicity, it's those that I'm focusing on. Also, for the sake of simplicity, and to allow focus on the build-up, I've ruled out the shot-only sequences. This, again, leaves us with majority. Next, for each of these sequences, we sort by how the final ball is delivered. To keep things simple and to allow for a large enough sample size, we look at predominantly pass or cross. And then, for each of these sequences with that type of final ball, they are clustered according to their location of assists and shots. Now, it is k-means clustering that is used here, and it basically works by grouping together the sequences whose assists and shots are closest together on the pitch. As an example, here are the crosses conceded, resulting in a shot against Middlesbrough last season from the right. The 3 points of the arrow are where the assist is made from, to where the assist is picked up, to where the shot is taken from. So this gives us room in case there is some more touches or a dribble after the final ball is delivered. Now, they are clustered into one group, and the centroid is plotted like so. It's effectively the mean average. Now, I mentioned it is just the assist and shot locations that are considered. This is partly due to simplicity, but also because we want our focus to be on the defence, and so we pay a little less attention to how the sequence started, which in most cases is further away from the defence than the assist and the shot. Now, I also ought to mention here how the number of clusters k is decided. Whilst it's not an exact science for finding the optimum number of clusters for our data, we can do our best by minimising what's called the cost of the clustering. And this is a number that reflects how far away each member of a cluster group is from the centre. So, generally speaking, the lower the cost of a clustering, the more accurately representative that clustering is. So, right, what do we do after we've sorted by final ball and clustered? Well, we plot the centroids, like that. And this is why minimising the cost of the clustering is important. We want our distilled data to be as accurately representative of a whole data set as best it can be. So, we go from this, the assist to shots conceded by Middlesbrough last season. There's not much you can take from this. It is fairly unreadable. But don't panic. We go to this, the assist to shot clusters conceded by Middlesbrough. Blue for pass, orange for cross. Now, you see that some of the arrows vary in both shading and thickness. And this is to represent the following factors. Firstly, the shading is proportionate to the cluster size, i.e. how many members of that cluster group there are. And so this is to be thought of as frequency. The darker the arrow, the more frequently exploited that cluster group is, that avenue is. Secondly, the thickness of the arrow is determined by the average expected goals value per shot in that cluster. And so this aims to be a measurement of danger. The thicker the arrow, the more dangerous those resulting shots are on average. So, what are we looking for? Well, we'll run through this Middlesbrough example. Firstly, we can look at the locations left to right. Now, in our case here, we see that the blue pass clusters are more darkly shaded on the left, indicating perhaps a weaker left back or left-sided centre back. It's also interesting to see that cluster A, coming from the right, the cross one, goes deeper into the box and slightly further across goal than cluster B coming from the left, which perhaps hints at the targeting of Fabio, a left back, not someone renowned for his aerial ability. We also look at the location in terms of distance from goal. Now, this is for mainly use in the comparative cases, but here it makes sense that clusters E and G are the thickest of the blue pass clusters, and they are found closest to goal. It's also interesting to see that by looking at clusters C, D, I, and E in particular, we see that the final ball is fairly horizontal on average. So maybe if you were coming up against this Middlesbrough defence, you could look into the effectiveness of playing a ball across their defence fairly centrally in order to open it up and then be able to take a shot. So let's get cracking on applications. First up is Arsenal. Now, towards the end of last season, they began to play free at the back, signalling surprise change from Wenger's 20-year commitment to a back four. It started with a trip to Middlesbrough in mid-April, and it continued during the remaining 7 league games after that. And this season, it is being deployed in most cases. But most of the time, significant changes in formation, such as this one, take time to implement, as players need to adapt. However, apparently this was not the case here. 5 goals conceded in 8 Premier League games. It sounds like the change in formation has worked out quite nicely. However, the expected goals tally told a different story. Around 13 expected goals were conceded during those 8 Premier League games. So let's see how this is reflected on the graphics. Here is Arsenal playing 4 at the back, and here is Arsenal playing 3 at the back. Now, I think firstly, the most obvious change is the incredible advancement of cross cluster B coming from the right. Not only does it get closer to the goal line, but the origin of the cross also seems to make its way into the box. Now, this is probably down to the advanced positions of the Arsenal wing-backs, getting caught upfield when an attack is broken, maybe. But I also think now is a good time to point out the limitations when dealing with small sample sizes. As we only have 8 Premier League games to work with last season playing that formation, we don't have that many shots, and so outliers can have a big impact. Secondly, we see that when playing free at the back, all of the arrows end within the box. This is indicative of a poorer defence, as it means that in general, they are conceding shots closer to the goal. Now, relating this back to the change in formation is quite a curious case. We see that when playing 4 at the back, the blue pass clusters are all found fairly centrally in front of goal. However, as we go to the 3 at the back case, we see they are more spread out on the width of the pitch. Now, it might be useful here to try and attach results of tracking data in order to determine whereabouts the defenders are as these shots are taking place. Having said that, from this comparison of graphics alone, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that Arsenal conceded a fair amount of chances in the avenues between centre-back and full-back. So maybe from a performance analysis point of view, it might be where you say, right, regardless of formation, these avenues between centre-back and full-back appear to be a problem for us. What can we do about it? Though, one aspect that does not quite make sense is cluster E in the 3 at the back case. You'd think that assists to shots directly in front of a back 3 are less common due to the increased number of centre-backs. This could again point to poor defensive performances or perhaps the difficulties with a small sample size. So there you have it. From this comparison of graphics, it does point to worse defensive performances under the new system. It's understandable really. It does take time to implement those sorts of changes. So next up is Atlético Madrid. Now, in terms of conserving a lead, they are one of the best teams at defending. By sorting their shots conceded by whether they are level or ahead, we can see how this factor of game state impacts on their defence. Just by looking at their numbers alone, you can see it's reflected in both the goals against and expected goals against tallies, how effective they are in closing out a game. Funnily enough, there's not sufficient sample size for when they're behind. So, going from Atlético level to Atlético ahead, we see firstly, almost all clusters are pushed back. That is a good sign. it means they are conceding shots from further out. Emphasising that is the fact there is no longer a full cluster found within the box. We can also see that the arrows are generally thinner when they are ahead, meaning that those resulting shots are less dangerous as they hold a lower expected goals value per shot. Again, that's a good sign. Interestingly though, we see that our focus shifts from the defensive right when level to the defensive left when ahead due to the shading of the blue pass clusters, which represent frequency. So you could perhaps interpret this as Juanfran being more attacking when level, or perhaps Felipe Luis being more attacking when ahead. It is hard to tell, and this is where you'd need this to be part of a process in order to understand why. But to be honest, it doesn't sound quite right to be labelling Atleti fullbacks as attacking in any sense. So we can take a step back now and have a look at the whole sequence. And so this includes build-up, assist, and shot. And we see that when level, all the clusters represent sequences of a fairly similar average duration of time. There is not much range in that. However, when Atletico are ahead, we see that it is the pass clusters A and B which represent the longest sequences in terms of time. This is also reflected in the increased proportion of transition sequences. So you could perhaps interpret this as when Atletico are ahead, they are very happy to let the opposition play out from the back, let them come at them because they know they can very effectively shepherd out the attack onto the wings, resulting in a cross, which players such as Diego Godin just love to defend. But how can we get a better idea of this build-up play? Well, we can cluster the passes in the build-up play. Now, you can see it is remarkable how early on, when ahead, the build-up play has to get to the flanks in order to result in a cross against Atletico. When level, they allow these passes from closer to the box out onto the wings. But when ahead, we just see blank space. So this perhaps indicates that Atletico become a very compact team when they are ahead, and there is no way through them, you simply have to go around. But we should note we are somewhat limited by only considering the passes rather than touches or dribbles as well. And also, these are only ones leading to a cross and a shot. But hopefully this does give us a better idea of that build-up play. Now, my third and final case, it looks at Southampton. Transitioning between managers often signals a different style of play. Going from 15-16 under Ronald Koeman to 16-17 under Claude Puel, the setup was supposedly more defensive, even though the actual number of goals conceded did increase. Now, in this case, with the sample size of both cases being a whole season, I opted to include the pass before the assist as well on the diagram. Whilst this means some of the accuracy may be lost, it does give us a better idea of where the play comes from. So here is Southampton in the 15-16 season. We see that the crosses, A and B, look to be the most dangerous as they are the thickest. However, it is cluster A that comes from slightly further out and a bit more on the flanks that is more frequent due to its increase in shading. Also, we see that cluster C is the one that starts from furthest out. Now, quite interestingly, cluster C contains the lowest number of touches or passes on average for the sequences, yet it has the highest values for directness and direct speed. So this cluster here seems to represent the attacks against Southampton that perhaps get in behind the defence, the direct attacks against Southampton. And we can see that whilst it's not quite as effective as the other blue pass clusters, it's not drastically less. However, as we move on to 16-17, it's pretty reassuring to see that that direct attack cluster, cluster D in that case, stays in a fairly similar place. However, we see that it is a lot thinner and it also starts a lot closer to Southampton goal. And this reflects this is reflective of a more defensive setup. The defence is deeper lying. And so, first of all, these direct attacks that get in behind the defence have to start a lot closer to the goal. And they're also a lot less effective. It's also interesting to note that the properties of the two cross clusters swap side to side. It is cluster B that starts from further out than cluster A. Now, we can see that clusters C and E appear to converge to just left of centre on the edge of a box. So this looks like quite a dangerous area for Southampton. So maybe from a performance analysis point of view, it'd be where you say, right, it seems that even though the final ball comes from both sides, we seem to be conceding a lot of shots in that area. What can we do about this? So to sum up this example, it is reassuring to see some sort of continuity going from season to season for the same team, whilst in keeping with a more defensive setup. So during this presentation, I've been showing you how clustering the final ball can give us a good understanding of how a team concedes its shots. I think it works very well as a good first step, or as a very general overview. Now, it can be used as a standalone graphic where you look for relative weaknesses of one team in one situation, or as a comparative graphic. So, in addition to the cases that I showed, there's a lot of scope for using this to compare. You could compare it between the relegation candidates of a certain league, or perhaps the defensive performances at home and away from home for a certain team. You could even use this to assess the impact of an absent centre-half or defensive mid, provided you have a large enough sample size for both with and without. However, it's not a one-stop shop. It has to be part of a process blended with video or tactical analysis in order to get a better understanding of why this is happening and then how you can address the problems that are discovered. There is also room for improvement. I found that a common theme across most cases was that the cross clusters generally held quite a high expected goals value per shot. So it does make sense. The shots come in and the crosses come in and shots that result from that are found quite close to goal and fairly central. So you'd expect them to be quite dangerous. However, with this common theme across most cases, and so a thick orange line in most graphics, it does impede comparison in some way. Now, I think applying a similar process to determine where a team defends well could be a solution. So instead of searching for their weaknesses, we search for their strengths. And this would hopefully lead to a more in-depth analysis of how teams defend. However, it would require a very robust definition of what constitutes an attack when there is no shot at the end of a sequence. Secondly, although I covered it briefly in the Atlético case, the events before the assist and shot are not incorporated in the basic visualization. And I feel it's somewhat hampering ourselves to only consider the final events of a sequence. So I think doing something similar to what I did in the Atlético case, and perhaps making an interactive visualization where you first see the assist to shot clusters before selecting one in order to see the passes in the build-up play clustered again, that would hopefully give a better, more rounded picture of the build-up play into the shot. That brings an end to my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm now happy to take questions.